Richard Milhous Nixon. One of the more controversial presidents in American history. Richard Milhous Nixon comes to office as the law and order candidate in 1968. He wins the 68 election against Hubert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president. Nixon basically comes in with a promise that he's going to end the war in Vietnam on, shall we say, American terms. Okay, and he calls it peace with honor. All right, now he is guided in this mission by a guy named Henry Kissinger, the first guy listed there. Okay, and again, if you go through this and you start typing as we're talking about this, it should kind of take an entire section out of this for you. So strongly advise you to have it up and at the ready, if you will. But Henry Kissinger is the Secretary of State under Nixon. All right, and he is a very active Secretary of State. We've talked about how Secretaries of State have been very consequential in presidential administrations, and certainly odds-on favorites to be president later on. Kissinger cannot apply as a presidential candidate because he is not born inside the United States. He brings kind of a more European vibe to the office, and he kind of brings this idea of, instead of trying to kind of agitate the Soviet Union and agitate the communist forces of the world, what do you say we try and get along with them? Okay, so it's kind of a change in direction. And what his mindset is if we're trying to isolate, or if we're trying to beat the Soviets, we should try and isolate them. Easiest way to do that is to make friends with everybody else and to make them feel like they are truly on their own. Okay, so after World War II, when we formed up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact, it basically took all of Europe and split it up. Kissinger's mindset is, well, let's not allow that to happen in Asia. Okay, let's not allow the nations to be divided between East and West in other parts of the globe. His primary focus is Asia. We've already divided up Korea. They're in the process of dividing up Vietnam, or at least attempting to. Kissinger kind of looks at it and says, what if we make friends with nations that we probably shouldn't or probably wouldn't under normal circumstances? So we start trying to open up the negotiations and the friendly relationship with China. He opens China, okay? So Kissinger kind of impresses upon Nixon the importance of making friends with a communist nation at a time when, we had been trying to isolate them as a whole. He's saying, you know what, let's isolate the main one. Let's isolate the Soviet Union by opening up negotiations with China. So basically, Nixon becomes the first president ever to go over to China. He goes in and opens the door by meeting with Mao Zedong. Now, Mao Zedong is the leader of China, communist China, after the Chinese Revolution. After the Communist Revolution in China in the late 1940s, Mao becomes Chairman Mao. He becomes the leader of the Communist Party in China and therefore the leader of China. He meets with Mao. He meets with his other officers within their kind of communist regime. He meets with a guy named Deng Xiaoping, who's going to actually take over for Mao when Mao dies. And he opens up some friendly relations with China. By opening China, it eases the tensions of the Cold War a little bit. It kind of makes it seem like, all right, well, we can make friends with a nation that we are supposed to dislike. And keep in mind, China was the one that we were concerned about fighting in Korea and then fighting in Vietnam during the 1960s. So by Nixon meeting with Mao and at least attempting to have relations and cooling things off a little bit, it, weirdly enough, kind of snowballs to where we cool off tensions with the Soviet Union as well. Through those negotiations, we start basically laying the groundwork for ending the conflict in Vietnam. The conflict in Vietnam by that point had become unbelievably unpopular. Everybody who was running for the presidency in '68 had some method or some belief that, hey, we need to stop this, we need to, end this conflict and bring it to a conclusion. We're going to pause real quick because it is breakfast. So continuing with good old Nixon here, Vietnamization was his plan to end the war in Vietnam. It's a lot more complex than this, but the basics around this is we're going to train Vietnamese soldiers to take over for our soldiers when we send them home. Okay? So for every American soldier we send home, we train somebody to take their place. It's kind of what we're doing in Afghanistan right now. Okay? It's what we've been trying to do in Iraq. History teaches us that this doesn't work, because Vietnamization did not work. The South Vietnamese soldiers that we were training, some of them ended up being what were known as Viet Cong. These were Southern Vietnamese soldiers that actually were on the side of the North. So all we were doing was training them on how to kill us. Okay? We also had a number of South Vietnamese soldiers that realized they were not ready to fight the North Vietnamese with Chinese support, with Soviet support. So the whole program ended up imploding upon itself, unfortunately. But it does bring a quicker conclusion to the Vietnamese War. Okay? Standing to gain from all this would be the Soviet leader during that time period. Khrushchev had died, and he had been replaced by, quite honestly, one of the ugliest men in human history, Leonid Brezhnev. Okay, for those of you with your computers open a new window and look up Leonid Brezhnev. Tell me he's not one of the ugliest people. Now, you want to compound the ugliness? Find a picture of Nixon and Brezhnev together. Nixon and Brezhnev might be the ugliest pair of world leaders ever, and that's saying something, because we've had some pretty ugly world leaders.
Does he have really bushy eyebrows?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Look the unibrow?
Sure.
Yeah, he's pretty ugly. So far as I don't know.
The only reason I bring up Brezhnev, however, is Brezhnev does tend to want to ease tensions too. He's not as warlike as Khrushchev. Brezhnev did not have the World War II background that Brezhnev did. Brezhnev at least kind of trusted the West a little bit more. So this is no longer going to be a Cuban Missile Crisis type scenario. This is no longer going to be, let's build a wall. Brezhnev's not going to come over to the UN, bang his shoe, and say, I'm going to kill you all. Okay, Brezhnev kind of eases tensions. Khrushchev goes along with that. Kissinger goes along with that in the State Department. And so we start to see a cooling of tensions, better known as détente, D-E-T-E-N-T-E. So if you ever see the term détente, that's what it means. It means an easing of tensions, especially during the Cold War. All right? So bottom line is Brezhnev does tend to kind of work with Nixon a little bit more. So Nixon on the foreign policy front looks like a genius. Okay? This is why he close to re-election in 1972. Okay? Nixon is super popular because people kind of view it and say, you know, his policies may not be popular at the time, but it seems to be working. Okay? And so, not surprisingly, when he sees through what is known as the Yom Kippur War, which is another war between Israel and their enemies over in the Middle East, Israel was being attacked by numerous countries. The main one was Egypt. When we kind of see that through, where not only do the Israelis survive the war, they win it pretty handily with American assistance, people kind of look at Nixon's time period here and say, yeah, okay, Vietnam is winding down, but that's what we wanted. It wasn't working out very well, so we wanted to get out of Vietnam. He's doing that. He's opened up negotiations with China. He's opened up negotiations with the Soviet Union. He's kind of helped out one of our major allies in Israel during that time period. When it comes to foreign policy, he's done pretty well. That's why Kissinger was held up as being a great Secretary of State, because it seems like the world's getting better. People felt better about things. He was even trying to guide us through a oil shortage and an oil embargo and a crisis looming with OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Okay? This is a trade agreement between mostly Middle Eastern countries that produce oil. That's what OPEC is, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. Okay? OPEC decides basically to threaten the United States with embargoes of oil, which would severely cripple us. We see Nixon kind of navigate a little bit with trade as well on this, to make sure that there isn't a massive oil shortage, even though we do end up having some oil problems all the way through the 1970s. Okay, if you ever watch a movie from the 1970s, you will notice that our gas guzzling cars, because if you've ever seen a car from the 1970s, they're big boats, okay? Just massive cars. Huge front ends, huge trunks. They got like 11, 12, 13 miles to the gallon. They just drank gasoline. So of course, if we then have to pay way more for gasoline or there's a gasoline shortage, we're not going anywhere. So all throughout the 1970s, we are going to be technically in a trade war with OPEC. It's going to culminate during Carter's time in office, but Nixon kind of gets the first rounds of this. We go back and forth with them through Nixon, Ford, Carter, and then pretty much with Reagan. Reagan kind of ends it. But it does help that we find some oil reserves in Alaska and we find some in Texas. And by doing so, it eases our dependence upon foreign oil. Okay? Now, Nixon also kind of comes in with a strategy known as New Federalism. This is his idea that the United States government needs to redefine its role with the state governments. This ends up being highly controversial, but at the time, there were a number of people that liked this. Here's kind of the basic tenor or premise of it. The federal government is getting too involved in your states. They're telling your states too much what to do. So we're going to pull things back. We're going to get less involved in the states, and we're going to let the states kind of figure out their own problems. Now, on the surface, most people would look at that and say, well, constitutionally, that might be a good thing. That means that the federal government's not controlling as much. But think about the 60s and 70s. What might be a bad thing that comes out of that? Discrimination, right? You're talking about a time period where the federal government had stepped in 1957, Eisenhower had sent in the National Guard to help the Little Rock Nine to go to school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay? Kennedy had sent the National Guard into the South to help register African American voters, to keep African Americans safe in places like Alabama and Mississippi, to guide students into the University of Alabama, to guide a man by the name of James Meredith as the first African American student in the University of Mississippi. The federal marshals and the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the federal agents from the National Guard had been very involved in these states, trying to desegregate these states. So by Nixon saying, hey, we're going to pull things back, there are going to be a lot of white Americans that are going to say, yeah, this is great. You're finally getting out of our state. So a lot of Southern whites are going to say, hey, this is a good thing. Okay? Southern blacks are going to say, well, now we're reverting back to what we were before. That's not a good thing. Who's going to enforce the Voting Rights Act? Who's going to enforce the Civil Rights Act? We're now depending upon our local law enforcement again, and that was not necessarily something they were looking forward to. Okay? And so New Federalism tends to have kind of a tenor of being somewhat racist, because even though it may not be the intended purpose that Nixon wanted, that's kind of how it's taken. Okay, yeah, there's less governmental control, but is that necessarily a good thing across the board? This also lends credence into what is known as the Southern strategy. And I had a student the other day ask about, when did political parties kind of start to shift? When did, because Martin Luther King Jr. was a registered Republican. So a lot of African Americans nowadays look at that and say, MLK was a Republican? That's weird, because a lot of African Americans will say, hey, my party affiliation is the Democratic Party. So when did that switch? How did that happen? There's all kinds of arguments, and it's still very new scholarship. So and there's no one lightning rod event that makes blacks turn to the Democratic Party and whites in the South turn to the Republican Party. It kind of happens over time. Okay. 1948, the Dixiecrats kind of split off of the Democratic Party because they don't like Truman's desegregation of the military. 1950s, you have Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott. You have the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. You have a number of things that happen that Democrats tend to kind of push. But even Eisenhower, as a Republican president, was also on the side of civil rights as well. They passed the Civil Rights Bill in 1957. So that, again, it's not like there's one lightning rod moment that makes black Southerners say, well, now I'm a Democrat, the hell with the Republicans. and then the whites to do the same thing in the opposite direction. The heck with the Democrats and going Republican. But this shift generally happens over time, and one of the final nails in the coffin for this shift is a man by the name of George Wallace. Anybody know who George Wallace is? No? George Wallace is a white governor of Alabama who is most famous for saying when he was inaugurated as the governor of Alabama in the early 1960s, he is famous for saying, I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. He is all about whites and blacks being separate all the way through the South. He is widely considered to be one of the most racist people during the Civil Rights Movement. Now, Wallace, of course, did a lot of that for political purposes. He was appealing to the people of Alabama that he was going to be the guy that was going to guide them through the civil rights mess, if you will. Did he really believe it? The scholarship is on both sides. Some people thought he just did it for political points. Other people thought, yes, he was that racist. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, okay? But he, did things like standing on the schoolhouse steps. If you ever watched Forrest Gump at the very beginning, he's standing at on the schoolhouse steps refusing to allow African Americans to come into the University of Alabama. That's George Wallace, okay? He gets arrested by the National Guard for doing it, okay? So he's willing to go to jail to stand up for what he thought was white Southern rights, okay? I don't know if anybody in here has heard of Leonard Skinner, the band. You guys, I think everybody's at least heard Sweet Home Alabama, one of their major songs. Sweet Home Alabama is actually a fairly, they call it the Southern anthem, but it's fairly racist. Because if you listen to the lyrics of Sweet Home Alabama, in verse 2 or 3, I can't even remember which one, at some point they say, Sweet Home Alabama, where the skies are smooth and the governor is true. Well, who's the governor they're referring to? George Wallace. Okay? They're absolutely supporting white nationalism at that point. They're supporting George Wallace. Well, Wallace in 1968 had split off and formed his own Southern political party, okay, the Independent Party. And he had run fairly well. He won some electoral college votes in the South because the South was tired of the Democrats and Republicans not standing up for them in their mindset. So it kind of confirmed that those states were tired of desegregation and didn't like government control. So what is the Southern strategy? Nixon kind of points to it and says, well, how do I get those voters to stop voting for somebody like Wallace and instead to vote for somebody like me? And in 1972, he starts the Southern strategy, where they start appealing to white voters that Nixon is listening to you and he's doing things that will help you. So not surprisingly, in 72, instead of voting for Wallace, who ran as a third-party candidate and got shot while doing it, mind you, Wallace was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He was paralyzed by the bullets, okay? So there was an assassination attempt, okay? Wallace ends up, not carrying the southern states like he did in 68. In 72, they go instead mostly to Nixon, okay? So the Southern strategy does work, and a lot of scholars will point to that and say that's when a lot of the white Southerners started voting Republican, and that's when a lot of the Southern blacks started voting Democrat, okay? Again, there's no lightning rod moment, but that seems to be the general shift that happens, okay? Now, during Nixon's time in office, we also see the culmination of JFK's vision. The irony is that JFK beat Nixon in 1960 to become President of the United States. He puts forth a vision that by the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon, and Nixon ends up being the president that is in office when it actually happens. Okay, in July of 1969, Neil Armstrong descends the ladder onto the surface of the moon, famously says, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and we leap ahead of the Soviet Union in the space race. In fact, we leap ahead so much that nobody's ever been back. It's only been Americans on the surface of the moon. There's never been any other country to actually make it to the moon and back, okay? So the only flag that's up there is the American flag. It is bleached white by this point by sunlight, okay? So if you ever manage to get a telescope that is strong enough to actually see the surface of the moon, we have left things up there. There's a little, what we call space junk just sitting up there. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen the conspiracy theories online. The all you need is a telescope with a strong enough lens to prove that we actually have been to the moon. Okay, we got a little buggy up there. Yes, our astronauts at one point went up there and drove around on the surface of the moon. They've left some things up there. The flag is still there, but again, it's not red, white, and blue anymore. It's just plain white because of the fact that there is no atmosphere on the moon, so it's just getting hit with UV rays the entire time. Okay, but again, you can prove that we've been up there. Okay, and of course, one of our astronauts in the early 70s hit a golf ball that is still traveling. It's the longest drive in human history. Okay, they hit a golf ball that just somewhere out in space, there's a golf ball just sailing along. Okay, again, they're doing research, but it did look a little weird that you're driving a golf cart around and then hitting a golf ball. Only in America would we go all the way to the moon and then drive around. Okay, but needless to say, Apollo 11 is the first of those to actually make it there and explore the surface of the moon. Okay. Also, later on in the 70s, we have the near tragedy of Apollo 13. If you've never seen that movie, you really should. Okay. Apollo 13 is about the mission that basically had an oxygen canister explode on it, and it was our efforts to try and bring those astronauts home. Okay. Very scary moments in our space program still exist to this day. Okay, and Elon Musk the other day just added another chapter when he successfully got some SpaceX folks up to the International Space Station. They'll be there for 6 months. Somebody immediately started asking about his aspirations to go to Mars, and he said, well, yeah, we're years away, but there's going to be some deaths along the way. He basically was admitting some astronauts are going to die with the attempt to go to Mars, and a lot of people immediately were like, well, how can you say that? Shouldn't safety be the #1 priority? He's not wrong. We tried to go to the moon and people died in that process too. We had near-death experiences and we had death experiences. So this is not something that should be really all that controversial, quite honestly, but of course in America we worry about any death, which is nice. It's nice, but there's a reason why the Russians got ahead of us in the space race. They didn't care if their guys came back safe. Okay? Anyway, we have relaunched with the addition of the Space Force. There's a new push for us to go back to the moon again. Okay, we'll see if that actually occurs. Okay, I think we're a little too worried about the pandemic right now to worry about the moon, but the moon and Mars are, in your lifetime, going to be front page news again. Now, of course, at this point, we're talking about Nixon being very popular, coasting to re-election in 1972, and looking to be one of the greatest presidents of the 20th century before he is derailed by something known as Watergate. First of all, anybody know what Watergate actually is? Not the scandal, just the actual, what is Watergate? Good.
Yeah, Barbara.
Believe it or not, it's a hotel. The Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. This is what brings Nixon down, okay? During the 1972 election, he's running against a guy named George McGovern. George McGovern was, a candidate that liberals really liked, but Nixon was super popular, and the Democrats really didn't understand that Nixon was going to coast to re-election no matter what. Okay? So they made it seem like on election night, this is going to be a real close election. Now, Nixon had lost a really close election in 1960. And Nixon, we didn't realize until later, is a super paranoid individual. He thinks it's going to be stolen from him. He's worried. So his re-election campaign, which was called the Committee to Re-elect the President, okay? If you're ever going to have an acronym for your re-election campaign, the Committee to re-elect the president. What's the abbreviation? CREEP. This should have been a pretty clear sign that something was immediately wrong with this re-election campaign. Some people in CREEP get this idea that they should go spy on the Democrats. So these Republican operatives who work for CREEP break into the Democratic National Headquarters Washington, D.C.'s Watergate Hotel. They break in, they start stealing information, they're looking for file folders that contain donor information and strategy of how they're going to try and appeal to voters. It's really stupid that they did this. Not only did they break in, they get caught. Okay, a night watchman notices that there's a piece of tape over a door, okay, that if I break into this classroom, if I want to make sure that I don't get locked in or out, the easiest thing for me to do is take a piece of duct tape and cover over the latch. Okay? Well, the night watchman happens to notice that there's tape on a latch. He opens the door, removes the tape, and immediately calls the police. So he basically locks them in to the Democratic National Headquarters. When the police show up, they arrest these 5 individuals, they go to prison, they pretend they don't speak English. They keep on saying, no hablas inglés, no hablas inglés. So they pretend that they are Cubans. An interpreter shows up, goes in, starts talking to them in Spanish, comes out and goes, those guys are not Cubans. They are white guys who cannot really speak functional Spanish. So sure enough, they end up tracing them back to the committee to re-elect the president. Nixon looks at the reporters who are asking him questions about this and says, I don't know these guys, I've never met them, I'm really embarrassed, I can't believe they work for us. And he just disavows any knowledge of any break-in ever. And the story goes away. Nobody talks about it, everybody just says, well, these are 5 people who did it on their own. You know, this is really no tie to Nixon, and it just kind of goes to the back page of the newspaper real quick. The problem is that there are 2 reporters, a guy named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who meet up with somebody who is a contact in the White House, who you guys have heard of anonymous sourcing, right? Somebody comes up, tells you what's going on, but says, do not mention my name. Well, Woodward and Bernstein managed to get a high-ranking person within the White House. Now, we have since found out that it was not a high-ranking person. It was just somebody who worked in the White House, worked in the intelligence industry, and basically kind of overheard this stuff through conversations and was feeding it to Woodward and Bernstein. They basically get this information that not only did Nixon know about the break-in, but helped to plan it and its cover-up. And when Bernstein and Woodward say, well, what kind of proof do you have? This contact basically relays that Nixon has been bugging his own White House. He has basically been recording everything that happens within the Oval Office. And if you can get those recordings, if you can get those tapes, you'll be able to prove that Nixon was lying. Well, they start reporting on this. Nixon immediately says, you're lying. They say, well, provide the tapes. We know you have them. Nixon refuses, says, I got executive privilege. I'm the President of the United States. I don't have to share anything with you. They then go through what eventually becomes known as the Freedom of Information Act. This doesn't happen. This is not in effect in the 70s, but through court orders, they basically finally get these tapes. Now, some of the tapes had been doctored, dubbed over, they were nothing but, static, or it seemed like they were, censored in some way, shape, or form, but some of them weren't. And some of these tapes totally implicate Nixon and many of the people in his White House. Not only did they indeed know about the actual break-in, but they knew about the cover-up as well. Nixon then becomes the only president in American history to resign from office. Okay? He sees the writing on the wall. Not only is he going to get impeached, he's going to be convicted. Okay? I don't know if you remember the name Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater, who was much more important during LBJ's time in the White House. Barry Goldwater is a senator from Arizona who ran against LBJ in 1964 and lost. Goldwater is still, at that point in the 1970s, the leader of the Senate Republicans. He goes to the White House, looks at Nixon and says, sir, if you get impeached by the House, I don't have the votes in the Senate that are going to save you. Okay? You will be convicted and you will be removed from office. So Nixon does not want to be the first president ever removed from office, so he decides instead to resign. And like I said, he's the only president ever to resign from office. He was never impeached. The House never got around to it. Nixon basically left before that could happen. So that means the only presidents to ever be impeached still are Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, Bill Clinton in the late 1990s, and Donald Trump managed to do it twice in 4 years recently. doesn't mean they were thrown out of office. No president has ever been convicted and thrown out of office. Okay? Nixon's the closest we ever got. He probably would have been thrown out of office, so he just left. Now, when he leaves office in the hands of Gerald Ford. Okay? Now, Gerald Ford is the only vice president ever to never be elected to either office. Nixon had a vice president by the name of Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew had his own problems. He had some tax issues and some other problems when he was the governor of Maryland. So when that stuff started to hit the fan earlier in the Nixon presidency, Agnew decided to resign. He left, so they took Gerald Ford from Michigan to be the new vice president. Okay? He elevated himself from the Senate to now being in as vice president. Ford, by being appointed to that position, basically, now elevates to being the president, and he's never been elected to either office. He never was. Never was voted in as VP, never was voted in as president of the United States. But he takes over. Now, the reason they like Gerald Ford is that weird politician that's super honest about everything. He doesn't like to lie. He's a pretty principled guy. But that doesn't help you when you get up to the White House because you get blamed for everything. And look, why do presidents deflect? It's hard to get criticism and just keep on saying, yeah, that's me. Yep, I did that. Okay, so Ford's kind of a rare political animal that actually will take ownership over everything. The poor guy also has problems. Gerald Ford played football at Michigan, which, you know, as a Michigan fan, I love the fact that we have a president that played football at Michigan. But folks, he's a football player that his knees were gone by that point. Like this is well before we had technology that could do knee replacement surgery and everything. So he walked very stiffly and had a hard time getting around. So unfortunately for him, Gerald Ford fell down the steps of Air Force One. He also fell up the steps of Air Force One. The guy fell down a lot. Okay? Poor guy also happened to be president when Saturday Night Live started. Okay? And they made fun of Gerald Ford for falling in every episode, it seemed. Okay? A guy named Chevy Chase, who's, you know, older now, but Chevy Chase was one of the actors on SNL, and he used to impersonate Gerald Ford, and every single episode he would fall down. Okay, or do something else stupid. Ford also had 2 assassination attempts, both by a woman. Okay, both were unsuccessful, of course. Nobody ever hit him. One of them, he was walking through a crowd, I believe in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. But he was walking through a crowd of people, you know, waving and stuff. And somebody who was connected to the Charles Manson family decided it'd be great to, you know, assassinate a president. She jumped out of the crowd with a gun, tried to shoot him. Somebody tackled her to the ground before that could actually happen. Okay? A week later, he's getting into his presidential limousine, and somebody from across the street takes a shot at him. Crazy woman from that one I know was in San Francisco. She was taking a shot at him, and just as Gerald Ford always did. If you ever watched the YouTube video of it, the guy, this is Gerald Ford to a T. Gunshot rings out. He's getting into the limousine, and just like Gerald Ford, he backs up and looks up, like, what's going on? Instead of just diving in, his Secret Service had to, like, shove him into the car. Like, what are you doing? Get in the car. It's bulletproof, you know? Because she almost got a second shot off. She legitimately shot the first shot, and then he poked his head up. She had a beat on him, and there was a guy in the crowd who screamed out, the bee has a gun, and jumped on her, tackled her to the ground so that she could not get the second shot off. Okay? But, you know, Ford basically almost got killed twice as president of the United States. Almost killed himself going up and down the steps. But either way, poor Ford gets picked on for a number of things. But the thing that really cripples him is that he makes the very unpopular decision at the time to pardon Richard Nixon. Just because Nixon had resigned does not mean that Nixon was completely off the hook. He could face criminal charges. So what happened? Ford decides, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and just give a blanket pardon to Nixon so he can just walk away and we don't have to talk about it anymore. Now, in the mid-1970s, this was not popular. People did not like the fact that a politician seemed to just let another politician off the hook. Okay? To put it into modern day terminology, Donald Trump can still be held liable for anything he did in the White House. If they want to charge him with crimes, pertaining to the January 6th insurrection, okay, when the guys stormed the Capitol building, if they want to charge him with some crime associated with that, he would stand trial for it, okay? He's not pardoned. There were a number of people wondering if he was going to try and pardon himself, okay, which most legal scholars think would probably not hold up in court, but nobody's ever done it before, okay? There were some people that thought, I was one of them, I honestly thought a couple weeks before he left office, he would resign, and he would ask Pence to basically pardon him, that Pence would then become the 46th president before Biden took over, and that he would ask Pence to kind of give a bunch of different pardons, but I have a feeling Pence told him no. If that was kind of that crossed his mind, I have a feeling Pence would have said no, because Pence is a fairly principled guy too. He's kind of like Gerald Ford in that regard, okay? But needless to say, Nixon didn't have that. Ford decides to pardon him, forgive him of any crimes pertaining to Watergate, and because of that, Nixon never had to stand trial for anything. Nothing was ever brought against him. It just kind of went away. Now, a lot of historians have kind of gone back to that and said, you know what, that was probably a good thing. It allowed the United States to heal a little bit. It allowed people to move on from Watergate. But needless to say, Ford kind of has to deal with this. He has to deal with a bad economy. The economy started to tank during the mid-1970s. Okay, in the Vietnam aftermath, if you will, he had to deal with an out-of-control inflation market. His plan was called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN. The only thing that really accomplished was giving us the most comical buttons. People wore buttons that said, WIN, Whip Inflation Now. They're some of the most expensive buttons that you'll ever find of political memorabilia and propaganda, because people wore these buttons, and it was basically just like, feel better about the economy, feel better about where we're at, and the inflation will start to go down. It was just kind of like this, hey, if we all start thinking positively about the economy, things will get better. It didn't work. The economy got worse. Okay? So Ford had that to deal with. He had to deal with the aftermath of Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade technically happened during Nixon's presidency, but Ford was the one that kind of had to deal with the aftermath of some of the states kind of rebelling against it, and including his own First Lady, Betty Ford, who is better known, by the way, as being an alcoholic and being an addict who recovered and started her own clinic. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Betty Ford Clinic. That's Gerald Ford's wife, okay? She admitted that she had an alcohol problem while in the White House. That was not easy to do, okay? She went and sought treatment. She got better, and she started to open up centers for drug and alcohol prevention and treatment centers. So she was a very active First Lady. Betty Ford was, pretty brave to come out and kind of admit that she had those problems, okay? But she also kind of holds her own press conferences, has her own political beliefs, and she agreed with Roe v. Wade, which was not something that was very popular with her Republican president and husband, okay? What was Roe v. Wade?
Alcoholic?
It has nothing to do with alcoholism.
Oh, well.
I'm sorry?
Democrat?
Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court case. Anybody know what it's about? Super famous, folks. One of the most consequential decisions in American history. 1973, Roe v. Wade. It's over abortion, okay? This is the Supreme Court case that allowed for abortion across the United States. It declared that a state could not stand in the way of a woman and her decision to choose, okay? Now, it was not as simple as that. They basically said that the state could not make a decision within a certain time frame, basically. So are there states that say you can't have an abortion from this time of the pregnancy on? Yes. Are there states that say you can't have an abortion in certain circumstances? Yes. So some states have found ways to kind of get around Roe v. Wade a little bit, but this has been an argument ever since the early 1970s. Is abortion, or should abortion, be legal inside the United States? Ford kind of had to deal with the fallout of this. This was not exactly a easy decision that the Supreme Court made here, okay? So Roe v. Wade has become one of the more consequential of modern history Supreme Court cases, and Ford had to kind of navigate the stormy seas surrounding abortion. During Ford's term, the Group of Seven formed. The Group of Seven is basically the top 7 economies of the world, okay? Trying to kind of bolster a common trade mentality, if you will, and basically kind of coming up with how are we going to lead? You know, where are we going from here, okay? And this has also grown to the G8 nowadays, but there are questions as to whether or not Russia should be involved. If you Google search it, you'll notice it's the United States, it's Great Britain, it's France, you know, it's Germany, it's China, it's the big, Japan, the big economies of the world, but there are questions as to whether or not they should allow Russia to continue in the group. Russia was expelled from the group because they invaded the Ukraine a few years back. Russia has petitioned to come back in. Trump said he was fine with that. He wanted Russia back in because he felt like, hey, we should have them in here to at least discuss things. But Obama and Biden have been against it because they do want to punish Russia for doing something that would be against their wishes and against global security, if you will. And it's kind of a return to the Soviet Union if you allow them to go out and take these territories, if you will. It's very Hitler-esque what Putin was trying to do a couple of years ago with the Ukraine, because when he took that area of the Ukraine by force, his justification was, well, there are ethnic Russians that live there. This is actually Russian territory, and it's the exact same thing that Hitler said back during World War II. You know, why did you take those territories like the Sudetenland and the Rhineland? Well, there are ethnic Germans that live there. Okay, so it's very similar to the justification that Hitler said. And anytime you're comparing somebody to Hitler, that's not a good thing. You know, nobody ever thinks to themselves, oh, they compared him to Hitler. That's great. You know. So again, there's questions about this, but the G7 has been pretty influential at guiding world markets ever since it was formed during the 1970s. The fall of Saigon. Where is Saigon?
Saigon.
Where is it?
Said Saigon.
Where's Saigon?
That's in Vietnam.
It's in Vietnam, okay? Specifically southern Vietnam. The fall of Saigon is basically the last kind of shred of hope in the Vietnam War. And when the United States finally clears out of Saigon, it basically signals that not only is the Vietnam War over, but it's the first war that the United States lost, because North Vietnam and South Vietnam ceased to be separate. They are now Vietnam, and they are under the communist flag. That is the one time during the Cold War that the isolation strategy of the United States failed. Anybody remember what the isolation strategy was called? Started with a C. It was Truman's plan. The fall of Saigon is the only time that containment policy failed. Okay, containment. The idea that you keep communism where it is, you don't allow it to grow, you basically make it stay put and die. Because folks, communism cannot survive by being contained. Okay? It has to keep growing. It has to keep expanding. Okay? So Saigon falls. By extension, so does Vietnam. And Vietnam becomes a black eye on American foreign policy and wars. Because keep in mind, if you look at every American war, American Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican War, Civil War if you're in the North at least, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, all of those were victories for the United States. Korea was a tie. Americans don't like ties, but it was a tie. Vietnam's the first abject loss. You didn't achieve what you set out to achieve, so therefore it's a loss. It's very tough for the Americans to stomach, but that all happens during Ford's presidency. Not surprisingly, Ford does not get elected. And they say re-elected, but again, he was never elected in the first place. He loses to Jimmy Carter in 1976. I'm going to pick up with Carter and Reagan in the 7th Bell class. I'll post that video along with the LBJ video as well. If you watch those videos,